Okay, next slide. And it's all yours.
Okay, took me a little while there. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're privileged to have Dr. Chris Fonvielle as our speaker. Chris is Professor Emeritus at the Department of History at UNCW and is a renowned author and speaker on the American Civil War, especially in the Wilmington, the coastal areas, and our favorite tour guide, as you have seen already. And he's also not only for Fort Fisher, but also for the whole Cape Fear area. Additionally, he's an advisor to our board of directors. He's president of the Cape Fear Civil War Roundtable, president of the Cape Fear Revolutionary War Roundtable, and he'll be available to sign his books after his presentation. Let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Fonvielle.
Thank you. I wrote the introduction myself, particularly where it says renowned. I stuck that in. It is great to finally be with y'all. I've spoken to the roundtable at least 4 or 5 times. In fact, I'm a founding member back in the days of Max Williams and Tom McDonald and, of course, Mike Powell and Wally. Those were great days. But I think it's been more than 3 years since I last spoke here. My brain's getting to be like that magic 8 ball that we had when we were kids. And, you know, you asked it a question, and you shook it up. And what comes to the top now for me is try again later. You know, just where we are. Was it just 2 years ago? Okay, just 2 years. Well, there you go. My brain is try again later. If nothing else, it beats staying home to watch a vice presidential debate between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance, right? So I'm glad to see so many of you here. Now, I'm going to cover tonight the Wilmington campaign. I call it Closing Down the Kingdom. That'll become clear as we go through the material. I've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'll do it fairly quickly so that we'll have enough time for questions and answers, okay? All right, so slide number 1, Carter, if you would. Closing Down the Kingdom. That's a Thomas Laycock painting of Fort Fisher from 1888, but I need the next slide. Okay, now, on the eve, I'm going to provide some context for those of you who are newcomers. Many of you will know this, but Wilmington was the state's largest city and most active seaport in 1860. And by 1863, the Confederacy's most important seaport, and I argue by late 1864, its most important city. Next slide. When the war began, as you know, President Lincoln in the spring of 1861 called for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. He also proclaimed a naval blockade of the seceded states, with the particular focus being on the seaports. He understood that the South was a region of farmers, planters, and slaves, and would have to turn to Europe to supply it with military arms and equipment and civilian goods to fight this war effort. And so the idea was to impede, if not completely disrupt that trade. If there was any trade at all, it would be a smuggling trade. Next slide, please. Now, this was a gargantuan task in 1861 because the Navy was small, only 90 vessels, less than half were operational. Most of those were on foreign waters, like with the Mediterranean Squadron or the African Squadron. They could not be contacted by cell phone as we would do today. You had to dispatch ships to alert them to the ongoing war. But the idea was that the United States Navy would put up an effective dragnet along the 3,600-mile-long southern shoreline from the Virginia Capes to the Florida Keys to the Mexico border. That was a huge task. There were about a dozen major seaports, but there were only a dozen steamships in the United States Navy in 1861 that were operational. So that's one steamship to blockade each major port: Norfolk, New Bern, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, going around Pensacola, New Orleans, Mobile, Galveston, Texas, about a dozen of them. That was one steamship to cover the entire length of the coast of North Carolina. So this was going to be a very ineffective paper blockade only. The other idea, of course, was that you would also capture the Mississippi River and then strike into the interior of the Confederacy against strategic targets. But the legality of the blockade, the logistics of the blockade created problems for the United States Navy for the entire war. Next slide, please. The Confederate response to the blockade was to get Confederate commerce vessels that would smuggle supplies from Europe, from willing merchants and shippers, particularly in Great Britain, that would be willing to trade guns for high-grade Southern cotton. The highest grade cotton grown in the world was in the American South. 2/3 of our nation's exports in 1860 were Southern agricultural products. So the economies of Great Britain, France, and Germany ran on Southern cotton. So they were only too willing to trade with the Confederacy in exchange for stuff that the Confederacy needed. And it needed everything because trade with the northern states is now ended. Next slide. Now, the idea with the Blockade Strategy Board was to focus on the seaports. But they figured out pretty early on that the Navy Department could not do it alone. They would have to have expeditionary forces with them. And by the spring of 1862, the Union had made considerable advances. They had effectively closed Savannah. They had captured New Orleans. They had recaptured Norfolk. They had 2/3 of North Carolina's coastal plain, the Outer Banks, Albemarle, Pamlico Sounds, the major river systems, the Roanoke, the Neuse, Pamlico, Tar. They had all the river towns and cities. They were within 60 miles of Wilmington and should have gone after Wilmington then, when Wilmington was not well defended and not well armed. But instead, they hopscotched over Wilmington and went after Charleston instead, because that's where public and political interest centered. The nest of secession, Charleston, and Charleston didn't fall. It held on for 587 days in the longest siege of the Civil War. And of course, the blockade runners, as the ships became known that operated at Charleston and Point South, merely transferred their operations to Wilmington, which was closer to the Virginia battlefront anyway. Next slide, please. Nope, that's not my slide. That's your slide. All right. So Wilmington should have been the next target. Our next slide is our next target. There. Wilmington was now the closest major seaport to a major fighting front in Virginia. It was close to Bermuda, about 3 miles to the east. It was about 2.5 days trip north of Nassau, which were British transshipment points where large ocean-going merchant vessels brought supplies, offloaded them onto smaller blockade running ships for the final dash into the Confederacy. Next slide, please. And the Cape Fear was ideal for the blockade running trade. It was the only seaport that had 2 inlets, 2 ways in and out that gave blockade runners a choice of entry and exit at the river. Old Inlet, right out here, the main channel then as today, and New Inlet at the end of Highway 421 near Fort Fisher that's now closed off by the rocks. But at that time, opened by a hurricane in 1761 that sat on top of us for 4 days and created a new inlet. So they called it New Inlet. And that gave Confederate commerce vessels dual inlets into the river. And it was virtually impossible to stop blockade running. One Union naval officer said we were like a parcel of rats watching a rat hole that really had 2 ways in and out, and you never knew which hole the rat was going to use. And the rats were always coming and going at nighttime. So it was literally a cat and mouse game. And at Wilmington, mouse won 80 to 85% of the time. So this was a very lucrative trade. I used to tell my students, or ask my students, how did Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind make his fortune? Eventually, I had no idea who Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind was. I knew it was time to retire. He made his fortune as a blockade runner, right? And he got Scarlett O'Hara, and he did give a damn. Next slide, please. Okay, so you had ships like the Advance, which was North Carolina's own blockade runner. South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, the Confederate government got involved in blockade running. It was a very beneficial trade, not only to the Confederate war effort, but to the shippers and to the merchants and to the states. North Carolina had a surplus, what would be the equivalent of about $60 million at war's end. Nobody knows what happened to that $60 million. I only know I didn't end up with it. So the Advance, a beautiful vessel, made 17 runs through the blockade when a blockade runner only had to make 4 runs through the blockade to pay for the ships and the cargo, and everything else beyond that was pure profit. So potentially a very, very lucrative trade. And if you were a successful blockade running sea captain or a river pilot, name your price. You were the contract player of the NBA. You were the LeBron James of the blockade running world. Just name your price, okay? So they brought in what, on government account, artillery, long arms, edged weapons, medicine, blankets, supplies, provisions, but they also brought in civilian goods, because even during wartime, people wanted to be able to buy their big screen TVs and their cell phones and so forth. You have to keep the public contented. There is no successful war effort without public support, and the Confederacy knew that as well as any nation knows that, okay? Now, the other thing that Wilmington had was good lines of transportation. Wilmington was a railroad town between 1840 and 1960. 3 railroads ran into Wilmington by the time of the war, the most important of which was the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad, completed in 1840. Nancy, sitting right here, always reminds me to tell the audience that when it was completed in 1840, running from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, North Carolina, at 161.5 miles long, it was the longest railroad in the world. And then became even more important during the war. And by the way, anytime Southerners mention the war, we're talking about the War of Northern Aggression, the Civil War, that war. I knew I'd get a few claps on that. There are about 125 names. I was just trying to needle y'all a little bit. It's the Civil War we're talking about. The Wilmington-Weldon Railroad became Robert E. Lee's main supply route by 1863. And became even more important as the war went on and other seaports fell into Union hands or were effectively blockaded. Next slide, please. So, to protect the blockade runners, to protect the trade, to protect the railroads that were vital to the trade, the Confederate government invested a lot in building fortifications and batteries. They used existing fortifications like Fort Caswell, pre-war fort, and then built around it. Did you know that a whole nother fort was built all the way around Fort Caswell? It was a sand fortification because sand was indestructible building material, whereas brick and rubble, mortar, were very susceptible to heavy artillery fire. So on down Oak Island, you had Battery Shaw, Fort Campbell, Fort Holmes on Bald Head Island, At New Inlet, of course, next slide, you had Fort Fisher, which was the most important fort. It turned out to be the largest seacoast fortification in the Confederacy, and it guarded New Inlet, which became the most popular entryway for blockade running ships, particularly those coming out of Bermuda or out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Next slide, please. And from a bird's eye view, it looked like a big giant number 7. It was not a full bastion, a 4-sided bastion, but just 2-sided with a land front. And this is kind of a segue to our tour this coming January. A land front at the far right that protected the ground to the north, across which an enemy army might attack, ran from the Cape Fear River to the Atlantic Ocean about 500 yards, made a 90-degree turn that was called the Northeast Bastion, a 32-foot high earthen battery. Each of these gun batteries mounted with heavy seacoast cannons, and it ran for about 1,900 yards down the seacoast. And it was in those elevated artillery batteries that you had big cannons that protected the blockade runners as they came and went through New Inlet. But of course, they're trying to come in at nighttime anyway. Only if a blockade runner got into trouble, low on fuel or something, like engine trouble, would they attempt to get in during the daylight. And then they could be protected if they got close enough by the guns of Fort Fisher that would keep the Union blockaders offshore at bay. Next slide, please. The fort was commanded for most of the war by a Virginian named William Lamb, a newspaper reporter and lawyer turned military engineer, who, when he assumed command at Fort Fisher in 1862, greatly expanded and strengthened the fort. His commanding officer for most of the war was the Cape Fear Department Commander, W.H.C. Whiting. The smartest graduate at the United States Military Academy, class of 1845, had the highest grades of any cadet until Douglas MacArthur graduated, I think in 1906. They said he was really good at shooting marbles too, for what that's worth. Right, next slide, please. Now, by 1864, Wilmington had become so important to Lee's army, and by the summer, as you well know, his Army of Northern Virginia is fighting for its very survival against U.S. Grant's operational armies around Petersburg, the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the James, Petersburg, of course, being the second most important city in Virginia. Lee's army is strongly entrenched, beleaguered, and being armed and fed and uniformed by way of the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. He has said as early as 1863, Wilmington must be defended at all hazards. And by 1864, a more dire message, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. So the message was clear. The survival of the Army of Northern Virginia, and thus the Confederacy, depended upon the survival of Wilmington as a blockade-running seaport. That's why I argue by 1864, Wilmington was the Confederacy's most important city. You could have moved the seat of government from Richmond to Danville or Charlotte. But if Wilmington falls, Lee cannot maintain his army, okay? Now, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, who Abraham Lincoln called Father Neptune, I love that. And if you've seen the Lincoln movie, it starts with Welles talking about taking Fort Fisher and how important Wilmington is. He knew all along the importance of Wilmington. Even if it wasn't as important in his mind as Richmond, the capital, the capture of it would be just as damaging to the Confederacy. He knew that. But he could not get the support of the Lincoln administration or the War Department to go after Wilmington, despite the number of proposals he had made in 1862 or in 1863 to go after Wilmington. But nothing until 1864. Why the change? Okay, next slide, please. Well, the fall of the last open seaport in the Gulf Coast, Mobile. Mobile Bay was closed on August 5th. Y'all know the story. Admiral David Farragut blasted his way past with his flotilla of vessels. He's strapped to the rigging of the USS Hartford, his flagship. They blast their way into the harbor. He is warned by Captain James Alden of the U.S. Brooklyn. The Confederates have torpedoes in the harbor way. And Farragut allegedly said, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." I think he said, "Damn, torpedoes." Well, go ahead. But we like the Davy Crockett, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." So that largest naval battle of the Civil War closed Mobile Bay to blockade running. That left only Wilmington open to trade with the outside world. And then Gideon Welles goes to the White House and tries to get Lincoln's approval for an attack on Wilmington after all these years, and he gives it the thumbs up. Why? 1864 is what? An election year. And I used to tell my students, as long as you understand, it's always about power and money. And once you get power, you do everything you can to keep power. Lincoln wanted to be reelected. He'd already told members of his inner circle, the way the war is going in Virginia, that stalemate between Grant and Lee, there's no way that the Northern populace, who believed the war would be over in 90 days, as I did, and now it's 3.5 years later, and the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost in this war, and I'm going to pay a political price for it unless the tide of war turns and turns quickly. And that's why he approved Welles's newest proposal to go after Wilmington. But then things started happening rapidly. Okay, next slide. So he makes his case with Lincoln at the White House in August of '64. Next slide, please. But when they go to Grant, Grant needs more soldiers to go after Lee at Petersburg. He doesn't want to give up 10,000 soldiers as an expeditionary force to go against a seaport in the backwater of the Confederacy. That's the responsibility of the Navy Department. Send me more soldiers. I'm not giving up more. Go there. But he also understood Lincoln's political dilemma. If Lincoln is defeated in the election by George McClellan, the Democrat nominee, McClellan is going to become commander-in-chief of the nation and the army again. And he's already been fired by Lincoln 2 times. So if Lincoln is defeated in the upcoming election, Grant's out of a job. So understanding the politics involved, he agrees to give up the troops when the time is right. Well, when will that be? Okay. Well, with that tacit approval, the new commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, David Dixon Porter, who was, well, I won't name any names, narcissistic, egotistical, conceited, bombastic, but he's the guy that you want by your side in a barroom brawl. He was the Mike Tyson of the U.S. Navy. This guy got the job done. He's given the job of commander of North Atlantic Blockading Squadron with the tacit green light from Grant. He puts together the largest fleet of the Civil War, 150 vessels. From those, he chooses 64, including 5 steam frigates, 5 ironclads, including the USS New Ironsides, the strongest ship in the United States Navy, equivalent to a destroyer today. Each of these ships, 64 number, carried a total of 627 cannons, which they figured was going to take that kind of firepower to reduce Fort Fisher that only had 44 guns mounted in its batteries. Okay, next slide. Now, Grant handpicked Godfrey Weitzel, who was the chief engineer in the Army of the James, to be the commander of the expeditionary force if there had to be an expeditionary force. But the commander of the Union Department of Virginia and North Carolina, Benjamin Butler, finagled his way into taking over command, intercepting all of Grant's memos to Weitzel. And so he, in effect, became the de facto commander of the expeditionary force, much to the chagrin of Admiral Porter, who hated Benjamin Butler. Next slide, please. In fact, Butler wrote in his post-war memoir that David Porter hates me like the devil hates holy water. Their feud had gone back to the Battle of New Orleans back in 1862. They simply just did not like each other. So here's the service branch commander of the Navy and the service branch commander of the Army, and they're supposed to work in harmony to capture the Confederacy's largest, strongest seacoast fortification, guarding its most important seaport, and they're not even speaking to each other. They couldn't stand each other. This does not bode well for the success of the mission, but things were not all that well in the Confederate states either. Braxton Bragg, when it was finally revealed that Wilmington was seriously threatened by attack, was sent personally by President Jefferson Davis to take over command at Wilmington from General Whiting. Braxton Bragg was the most vilified Confederate officer. In fact, his most recent biographer, Earl Hess's title for his book on Braxton Bragg is The Most Hated General in the Confederacy. Now, how's that for a legacy? But he was. So how, in the 11th hour for the Confederacy, when Robert E. Lee has said that if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army, Jefferson Davis decides to send the most hated, mistrusted, vilified general officer in Braxton Bragg to Wilmington. Your guess is as good as mine, but when the Virginia media got a hold of it, headlines read, Braxton Bragg has been ordered to Wilmington. Goodbye, Wilmington. That's how little trust they had in Braxton Bragg. So he repairs to Wilmington in October of '64 to take over from Whiting. And Whiting and his men are just absolutely devastated by Whiting's demotion. So he shows up. He does leave Whiting as second in command. Whiting goes to Fort Fisher as a volunteer combatant and advisor to his protege, Colonel William Lamb. Okay, next slide. Now, again, that's how little faith people had in Braxton Bragg. Been ordered to Wilmington, goodbye, Wilmington. Next slide. Okay, so the attack comes, but after the election. Lincoln has secured another term, and he determines to finish the war out on the battlefield, not at a negotiation table, as the Democrats have proposed to do, which might lead to the restoration of slavery. Lincoln says, no, we're going to finish it on the battlefield. And his soldiers absolutely admired and adored him and his resolve. So the war will be won or lost on the battlefield. So he's reelected. Campaign gets underway anyway because they still have to close the port to sever Lee's lifeline, that artery supplies. Next slide. And we could spend the entire time just talking about the first Battle of Fort Fisher. It is so interesting, and we'll talk more about it on our tour, hopefully on January 15th, which just happens to be the anniversary of the fall of Fort Fisher. That'd be really cool. We will see some ghosts that night. Yelena Howell will be with us, who is the real president of the Cape Fear Civil War Roundtable, not me. There she is. She's much cuter than I am. And she came all the way from Russia to be here tonight, by the way. No, she is. She's from Russia. She's an American citizen now, but she's from Russia. We adore Yelena. All right, so Porter unleashes the largest naval bombardment of the Civil War. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, ironically, the birth of the Prince of Peace, 20,261 shot and shelled, which comprised about 95% of what Porter actually fired, the largest single bombardment during the American Civil War against Fort Fisher. But Fort Fisher held, in large part because at their own discretion, gunboat commanders allowed their gunners to establish their effective range of fire on shore by firing at the most visible targets above the fort, which were flags. From a mile to a mile and a half offshore from their battle stations, the fort looked like sand dunes, but they could see those battle flags flying over the fort, and that's what they aimed at. And it didn't take the Confederates too long to figure out what they were doing, and they moved all the flags to the back end of the fort and drew the fleet in that direction. And Colonel Lamb later wrote in his post-war memoir, never was there a bigger waste of gunpowder in the annals of warfare than at first Fort Fisher. So the Confederates held in that first battle. Okay, next slide, please. The troops did land on Christmas Day, but as they approached, led by Godfrey Weitzel, not Benjamin Butler, who stayed safely on board the Benda Ford offshore, he sent Weitzel ashore with a reconnaissance force. They approached the fort and saw that the fort was as strong after the 2 days of bombardment as it had been before. And an attack would be suicidal, not unlike an attack at Battery Wagner at Charleston, the movie Glory. So after reporting to Butler, Butler decided to abort the mission and return to Virginia with his troops. And of course, Porter was absolutely livid, although his performance or the fleet's performance at First Fort Fisher was not stellar. Well, what that led to, next slide, please, was a firestorm of controversy. Congress convened an investigation. They wanted to know who was responsible. They had put so much time and energy and money and resources into this failed attack. Somebody had to be held accountable. Grant stood by Porter because he and Porter had worked harmoniously together in the capture of Vicksburg in 1863. And no one liked Butler. Butler was the brag of the North. And so now Grant decides he's really interested in capturing Fort Fisher. And the reason is, next slide, because, and by the way, Braxton Bragg goes to Wilmington with a division of troops sent by Robert E. Lee to safeguard Wilmington, and the citizens of Wilmington present him with a brand new uniform, thanking him for the victory at Fort Fisher, and he was never there. Next slide, please. So Lamb and Whiting were absolutely convinced the Federals would return sooner than later to go after Fort Fisher again. Bragg was not at all convinced. Next slide, please. But while Grant had been indifferent in the first attack, now he took a heightened interest because of Sherman's capture of Savannah at exactly the same time as First Fort Fisher. He presented the capture of Savannah to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift, symbolically, of course. But after capturing Atlanta in early September, that November, he marches his 60,000-man legion across the state of Georgia, captures Savannah at Christmas 1864, and then Grant, glad to see that 60,000-man army on the seacoast, is ready to transfer it up the Atlantic seaboard to Virginia to reinforce his armies for one final push against Robert E. Lee at Petersburg. But having successfully marched to the sea in December, as you know, Sherman proposes instead to do the same thing through the Carolinas. My men are eager to punish South Carolina for starting this war, and I will not stand in their way. And we will destroy railroads and depots and supply caches, infrastructure, anything in our way, like an army of army ants. We'll destroy everything. And when we get to North Carolina, I'll go after Goldsboro on the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. If necessary, I'll attack Wilmington from the north. Or we can go west to capture Raleigh, the state capital. But ideally, what I'd like to do is, after capturing Goldsboro, is go right up the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad, tear it up, and then attack Lee's underbelly at Petersburg, Grant, while you hit him from the east. And we'll push him out of his defenses into open ground, and together we can converge on and destroy his army. Grant loved it. Later said, I would not have entrusted that movement to any other general officer but William Sherman, and authorized his northern expedition that historians call the Carolinas Campaign. And what that meant was that now we need to capture Wilmington, Grant says, for the Cape Fear River, navigable all the way to Fayetteville, 90 miles to the northwest, and the 3 railroads. And we can use those lines of transportation and communication to support Sherman's Carolinas campaign and bring this 4 years long bloody war to an end. So Grant now is really excited about going after Wilmington, starting with Fort Fisher as a launching pad. Okay, so that's the idea. Move through the Carolinas to get to Virginia. Next slide. Grant authorizes the Northern Expedition to begin. They'd start with going after Fort Fisher and then would move up river 20 miles to go after Wilmington. Next slide. He chooses as a new commander, he gets rid of Butler, sends him home to Lowell, Massachusetts, to his factory girls, as Sherman said later. He replaced him with Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry, commander of the newly organized 24th Army Corps, Army of the James. He's best known for being commander of the Department of the Dakotas in 1876, when George Custer's command was completely wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But his first independent victory in the Civil War was the capture of Fort Fisher, North Carolina. Okay, so he's affable, shy, almost introverted, very capable. And he's the new commander of the Expeditionary Force and instructed to cooperate with the mercurial David Porter, something that did not happen with Butler. Going along with the Expeditionary Force would be 2 brigades of 3,300 U.S. colored troops, veteran fighters. These guys were seasoned battle combatants. And they would be with the Expeditionary Force. Okay, next slide, please. So they returned on January 12th, as Lamb and Whiting both expected and feared. They were not notified of the fleet moving southward down the North Carolina coast, but recognized the growing number of lights off the Cape Fear coast the night of January the 12th. They were back, and Lamb notified headquarters in Wilmington. Bragg was caught completely off guard. He'd held a review that afternoon for Hoke's division, released the men to go out recreating that night in downtown Wilmington. When they got word at headquarters that the Union fleet was back, and Lamb knew just as sure as day would come that the Federals would land at sunrise. And sure enough, here they came by the thousands, and Bragg was nowhere to be found. He was reassembling the troops, marching them down towards Fort Fisher. They did not arrive in time to contest the landing that the Union troops said, like a frolic in the park. It was a picnic. We gathered oysters. We found a herd of beef cattle. We killed them. We had steaks. It was a grand old time. No resistance. Braxton Bragg, not a fighting general, to quote someone in those days. Next. So while they're covering the army going ashore, the fleet renews its bombardment, second largest naval bombardment of the Civil War, firing about 600 shells less than in the first attack over a 2.5-day period. But Porter instructs his gunboat commanders, don't fire at a flag or a flagpole. You focus on firing on the artillery on the land front that covers the ground across which the army is going to charge. Let's destroy, dismantle all of those artillery pieces to give safe passage to the army. And that's what they did. And with the practice from the first attack, they were spot on. Their fire was very, very heavy. Colonel Lamb said at one moment, 60 seconds on January the 15th, he counted the explosion of more than 100 shells inside his fort in a 60-second period. And that was continuous for 2.5 days. So it'd be like us trying to withstand a B-52 strike for 2.5 days. Okay, next slide, please. On agreement, after 2.5 days of heavy bombardment and a reconnaissance that showed the fort had been severely damaged and the artillery destroyed, Terry attacked the fort with 3 brigades of white troops while the black troops held the defensive line, because Bragg finally got within 4 miles of Fort Fisher with his division of troops, but never attempted to reinforce the fort or attack the Union army that was guarding the attacking Union army that was attacking the fort. That makes sense? You got that? He did nothing. He sat on his hands. And so the Union army attacked the fort, gained a lodgment. Lamb and Whiting were both severely wounded. Whiting would later die of his wounds. And then for 5.5 hours, it was a soldier's fight, hand-to-hand combat for possession of that fort. It was terrible and grand, as a number of survivors later wrote. Next slide, please. Sailors and Marines sent ashore by David Porter, who wanted to share in the assault, he said, but the sailors were armed only with well-sharpened cutlasses and revolvers to go up against Confederates standing on top of the fort with long arms that were capable of shooting a man down at 300 to 500 yards away. So it was a virtual slaughter of U.S. sailors and Marines, and it's the only time in Marine Corps history, the only time that Marines abandoned a beachhead was at Fort Fisher in 1865. But that's how severe the fire was against them. Next slide, please. But after all that time, they finally captured the fort about 10 o'clock that night. Whiting told his guys, you know, you've done your duty, boys, but they've got us. And they were all sent to prisoner of war camps. And as I said, Whiting would die. Lamb would survive, but limped for the rest of his life. But the fort was now in the possession of the Federals. Next slide, please. Well, what does Braxton Bragg do? He notifies Jefferson Davis and Lee in Richmond, I regret to inform you Fort Fisher has fallen. I thought it would hold like it did in December, but surprisingly it fell. He's done nothing to help it remain in Confederate hands. What should I do? And of course they both shot back, counterattack, retake the fort. Wilmington cannot be in the hands of the Federals, but he refused to do that because the fire of the fleet was so powerful that he figured his entire division would be destroyed if he attempted to retake the fort. So he just sat. He just dallied. That's what he did, okay? So Porter assembled a flotilla of vessels in the Cape Fear River, because remember, Wilmington's the objective now to support Sherman's campaign. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Next slide, please. But the capture of Wilmington was so important to Grant that he left Petersburg and went down the coast to hold a war council with Porter and Alfred Terry on board Porter's flagship USS Malvern on the Cape Fear River. That's how important the capture of Wilmington was to U.S. Grant and final military operations, that he came here personally, sailed right by here, and for 2.5 hours spent time figuring out the best way to capture Wilmington. And Porter and Terry both said, look, there's one major fort left that's going to give us some problems, but if we can capture Fort Anderson in Brunswick County, the way will be open to Wilmington. And so that's what they did. They focused on Fort Anderson. Grant said, good. Best and only thing to be done, capture Wilmington by way of Fort Anderson. So Grant personally authorized the attack on Fort Anderson, which y'all, I think we adopted that site years ago. Okay. So they would move upstream in what I call the last rays of departing hope for the Confederacy, because now it appears that it is. The sunset has appeared now for the Confederacy. Next slide. Bragg is above Fort Fisher, a place called Sugarloaf. Fort Anderson's across the river. The Federals capture Fort Fisher. They go around and capture Old Inlet because Bragg abandons all the forts on Bald Head Island and Oak Island, withdraws the forces to Fort Anderson. Federal forces move upstream in early February after they've been reinforced. Next slide, please. They attack Fort Anderson, the last major obstacle between them and Wilmington. There'd be a 2.5-day battle there. Next slide, please. A heavy naval bombardment from the river while Union Army forces move up from Smithville, now Southport, up through what is Sunny Point property today to attack Fort Anderson from the south. And the Confederate garrison, completely overwhelmed, outnumbered, and outgunned, retreated towards Wilmington, up towards Town Creek, where they would make one last stand. One more slide, please. The importance of Fort Anderson in 1865, look at that. You hear a lot about Fort Fisher. I've written a lot about Fort Fisher. I've even written a book on Fort Anderson. But to show you how important Fort Anderson was nationally in 1865, the biggest newspaper in the country, the New York Herald, front page news. But very quickly, the capture of Wilmington, Fort Anderson, Fort Fisher took back page news to the end of the war, Lincoln's assassination, so forth. But in the winter of 1865, this was big news, okay? Confederates withdrew on both sides of the river. After Fort Anderson was abandoned, Sugarloaf was abandoned, Bragg withdrew his forces up towards Wilmington. In fact, Bragg left altogether. On February 10th, the day before the Federals launched the Wilmington campaign, he left Wilmington on the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad to return to Richmond to reorganize his military staff, and didn't return for 11 days, by which time the Federals were on the outskirts of the city. And he came back in time to authorize Wilmington's abandonment. Okay, next slide. There'd be one last action at the Battle Forks Road at what is today the grounds of the Cameron Art Museum in downtown Wilmington. The fighting led on the Union side by U.S. colored troops. Really fascinating battle. But that was the Confederates' last stand and a very important African-American history site as well. Next slide, please. But Wilmington fell the very next day, February 22nd. George Washington's birthday, so Union troops thought, wow, this is good sign. We captured Wilmington on a very important day in America's history. And it really was the last rays of departing hope. I found a quote from a Confederate soldier from Wilmington. His name was William Calder, born and raised in Wilmington. And he was leaving Wilmington with the Confederate Army early pre-dawn hours of February 22nd. He said there were a few lights shining from homes in the downtown area, and they appeared to me to be the last rays of departing hope. I just thought that was so symbolic. So there's the title right there. All right, next slide, please. So the capture of Wilmington led to the end of blockade running. Lee's army could no longer be uniformed, armed, and equipped. Next slide, please. And as he had said so prophetically, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain his army. By no accident, 46 days after Wilmington's capture by Union Army and Naval forces, Lee was forced to surrender to U.S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And that's how important Wilmington was during the Civil War. That is why Wilmington was the most important city in the Confederacy in 1864. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I hope you agree with me. Thank you for hearing my argument. Next slide. Did I do that before 8 o'clock? All right. I'm getting better. I'll be glad to answer any questions that anyone might have.
And we're live with this month. How you doing, Chris?
Good. Good to see you, God.
Ben.
Yeah.
Now, again, we have our little podium set up over here for anyone that has a question for Chris on this talk. And I have one. It's just with Gideon Wells, the frustration he must have had in trying to get through to Lincoln and everyone else about Wilmington in 62, 63. How could he have dealt with that?
Well, it was tough, but you remember the game that we used to play flag or so it's Stratego. Remember Stratego? What was the object of the game in Stratego? Capture the flag. It had nothing to do with taking all the generals and the colonels and the majors and all that. It was to capture the flag. And the strategy was very similar. You capture the most strategic targets, whether they be industrial, military, or political. And that was the mindset of the Lincoln administration and all previous administrations. The American Navy really had not been heavily involved in operations in any war up to that time. And so the War Department particularly, but to a lesser extent, the Lincoln administration believed that all coastal operations, the blockade, cruising, whatever, that's the responsibility of the Navy Department. But our focus is going to be on the capture of strategic interior targets, and particularly Richmond. And then, of course, Chattanooga, and then Vicksburg. And much to the detriment, really, of the Navy Department's efforts to close blockade running. David Porter, Now, part of this is that Porter was a braggart, but he wrote in his post-war memoir, which is very, very good. It's a tome. He said, had Wilmington been captured in 1862 or 1863, as the Navy Department proposed, the war would have ended at least a year earlier and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But again, we could get into the politics involved in all of that. But yeah, he just could not get the ear of Lincoln or the War Department. And that's the short of it.
Would you explain again for all of our benefit, why not attack a point along the coast that was less fortified than Fort Fisher? Why did not the Federals come in elsewhere?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, if Fort Fisher is the largest, strongest fortification, not just guarding Wilmington, but in the Confederacy, why go after it? Why not just go around to Old Inlet and go after Fort Caswell or Fort Holmes? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, going through Old Inlet would have been an easier campaign. Now, they argued that, now, wait a minute, there'll be crossfire between Fort Holmes on Bald Head Island and Fort Caswell on Oak Island. We'd have to deal with that. But it really would have been easier to capture it, Fort Fisher, by going through Old Inlet. But they were also operating under the misconception that Fort Fisher was a four-sided work, not a two-sided work. All of their intel from escaped enslaved African Americans and Unionists was all bad. If you look at their charts that each warship commander had in 1864, it has Fort Fisher drawn in as a four-sided work. So even if they'd gone through Old Inlet and gone upriver, they still had to attack a very strong east and south side of the fort. That turned out not to be the case, but they didn't know that until after they captured the fort. But the other reason is you're not going to get headlines with an easy capture. You're going to get headlines by capturing the strongest seacoast fortification, guarding the Confederacy's most important seaport and city. That's going to get you headlines. And that's also going to help you big time with your budget come 1866. So there were politics involved. Not just strategy, but there were politics involved too. And that's Porter. Porter's like, nah, I don't want an easy fight. I want a hard fight. I want to fight people are going to remember. People remember Ali and Frazier. They don't remember Ali and Trevor Burbick, but they remember Ali and Frazier. And there were three of them, by the way.
I see a reference to Wells as Father Neptune. Is that what?
Yeah, Lincoln called him Father Neptune. I just think that's a great nickname for him. Yeah. And look, I really appreciate y'all coming tonight, by the way, and missing out on the debate.
Chris,
Yes.
Braxton Bragg, post-war, what's the story?
Oh, gosh, there's such an interesting story there. Bragg was just a very difficult person. He was temperamental. He was acerbic. He suffered from bad health. He was just an unlikable person. U.S. Grant wrote in his post-war memoirs, which are, by the way, are the very best presidential memoirs if you ever get a chance to read them. He wrote them for Mark Twain, who was his publisher, and literally crossed the last T and dotted the last I and died of throat cancer, but had those memoirs published, and they're fantastic. He wrote that in the pre-war Army, Braxton Bragg was serving in Florida during, I think, the Second Seminole War. And he was serving as both company commander and as quartermaster. And he got into a disagreement with himself over the distribution of supplies and went to the regimental commander to try and resolve the problem. And the commander said, my God, Mr. Bragg, you've argued with every Army officer, and now you're even arguing with yourself. Now, whether the story is true or not, it doesn't matter. Grant, used the story to make a point that this was a very, very difficult man. And by the way, he intensely disliked Jefferson Davis, who serving as Secretary of War under President Franklin not Pierce, but Pierce, in 1852, Davis was going to transfer Bragg out to Indian Territory, and Bragg was so mad that he resigned from the Army, went to Louisiana, married a rich, widowed planter woman, and became a civil engineer, very wealthy. And Grant said he intensely disliked Jefferson Davis until the war began, and Davis, remembering his old friend Braxton Bragg, promoted him through the ranks very quickly, and he became one of 19 Confederate lieutenant generals. And suddenly Braxton Bragg really liked Jefferson Davis. And as you know, Davis, after Bragg resigned in disgrace from the command of the Army of Tennessee in 1863, Davis brought him east to Richmond to serve as his personal military advisor. Now, Lee was the guy that he really went to for sound advice, but he had Braxton Bragg by his side. But why send Bragg to Wilmington when you could have sent Beauregard from Charleston, who'd held on to Charleston for 2 years, or Daniel Harvey Hill, or somebody else? But Braxton Bragg, nobody understood that choice. Does that answer your question? That's a long way around to get to the answer.
Hi. I hear all the time about how treacherous the waters are to come in and out of our area. And, even today we have pilots who have to take people in and out with local knowledge. So I'm wondering how that factored in to all these ships coming from up north, maybe not familiar with the water, how it factored in with tides, time of year. If you want to go at night, is that when it's high tide? Maybe. So and were there a lot of ships that didn't make it?
The Cape Fear is aptly named. The early explorers named it Cape Fair. Who wants to settle at a place called Cape Fear? But the name Cape Fear, because of the dangers to mariners, stuck. And as y'all may know, historians, archaeologists have discovered more than 5,000 shipwrecks along the North Carolina coast. So it literally is the graveyard of the Atlantic. There are hundreds of ships off the Cape Fear coast. We have the largest collection of Civil War shipwrecks anywhere in the world. We have 31 blockade runner wrecks. No place in the world, I guess in the universe, has more Civil War wrecks than we do. So essentially what happened is that you had to have a new inlet blockading squadron and an old inlet blockading squadron. Because even though the distance on the inside of the harbor was 6 miles as the crow flies from old inlet to new inlet and back, 6 miles one way, on the outside, the Union blockading ships had to go way out around Bald Head Island and Frying Pan Shoals that stretch 18 miles in the Atlantic Ocean for a distance of about 40 miles. So early on, it was virtually impossible to have a few ships at the Cape Fear and watch both inlets. So eventually they had what they called the Western Bar Squadron, or the Old Inlet Squadron, and the New Inlet Squadron. And they communicated with ships going around the shoals themselves, and eventually with rocket signal lights and so forth. But yeah, very, very dangerous. We don't have very many Union shipwrecks. There's the Iron Age at Lockwood's Folly, but no ship was lost during the bombardments at Fort Fisher. Anytime a Union ship got into trouble, they pulled them out of the line. So we don't have many Union wrecks, but yeah, it was very dangerous for them too. So what you needed was a good pilot, because the pilots knew the rivers like the back of their hand. They knew the shoals, they knew all the channels, they knew it all. And again, like the successful blockade running sea captains like Rhett Butler, name your price. And of course, when Union ships captured blockade runners, they not only wanted the ships, which they would purchase and convert into cruisers to chase speedy blockade runners. How better to capture a blockade runner than with a former blockade runner? But they also wanted to capture the pilots. And they would initially offer to let them join the United States Navy, and then they ratcheted up the intimidation factor. We know where your family lives. We know you. We know where your family lives. Now sign on the dotted line. And so they got river pilots that way too.
Any other questions that we have? Yes. Why don't you ask up here? And I'll get one over here.
You didn't mention Butler's dynamite ship.
No, I didn't. And as I said, we could have spent the entire night just on first Fort Fisher. And I wanted to save some good stuff for our tour in January. But a novel feature in the first attack that Butler had come up with was to take an old steamship and load it with upwards to 300 tons of gunpowder and set it with an intricate fuse system called a Gomez fuse system that would blow all of the gunpowder up simultaneously. There was some precedent that the explosion of an enormous amount of gunpowder could level buildings within a block or a block and a half. It had happened in Erith, England. So Butler and his engineers said, well, why don't we load up this vessel? And they chose a patrol boat called the Louisiana, which just happened to be built in Wilmington, Delaware, and lost its life in Wilmington, North Carolina. They took this patrol boat from the Sounds of North Carolina, loaded her with not 300, but 215 tons of gunpowder, and on Christmas Eve, ran her ashore near near Fort Fisher. And the idea was that the fuse system would detonate all the power simultaneously. But once they ran her ashore and no one knew exactly where she was in relation to Fort Fisher, in fact, the Louisiana, the skeleton has never been found. No one knows where she is. The commander decided, well, I think I'm going to put some lighter wood in the propeller shaft. And so if the fuse system doesn't blow all the gunpowder up, then eventually the fire that I set in the propeller shaft will eventually blow it up. And that's what happened. And it ended up blowing up haphazardly and turned out to be such a dud that it became known as Butler's Folly or Butler's Toy. He was heavily criticized for that. But we'll talk more about that when we go to Fort Fisher.
Hey, Chris.
Thank you for the question. Yes.
One final question about Bragg. Given the fact that he was such an exemplary commander, how did he get a fort named after him after the Civil War?
Oh, well, the Army, of course, is no longer Fort Bragg, it's Fort Liberty. Yeah, and the government spent $6 million changing the name. Imagine what we could have done with $6 million. So $6 million to change it to Fort Liberty. They named it in honor of Braxton Bragg as a U.S. Army officer, and he had an illustrious career in the United States Army before the war. He was brevetted 3 times during the Mexican War. 2 times his soldiers tried to assassinate him, but that's another story for another night. So the Army would say, well, we dedicated the fort to Braxton Bragg, Captain of the United States Army, not Braxton Bragg, Confederate General.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
Thank you all very much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Good to see you, guys. Good to see you too. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I do have books for sale if anybody's interested.
And I will speak up serious tales.